Welcome back to the Brew Bot Development Series. And hey, look, it's only been a month. Last episode marked the 1-year anniversary of this series, and set the record for the longest I've taken to make a video since my channel started. So that video must have turned out pretty freaking insane, huh? Well, let's just say I'm uploading monthly now. I was able to get a good amount done last episode, and I've got an actual plan for the game now. And an actual upload schedule is going to be really handy for ensuring that I'm actually making progress, and not just running circles around different ideas or mechanics. Now that we have a plan for the game, we can almost start making the actual game using the systems that I've built. We just have 2 more of those systems left to build. And those are the gadgets, which are like combat abilities that you can equip, and the decoration system. There's also some things like UI and better sound effects, but those are all things that can be workshopped alongside creating actual levels. The decorations and gadgets, though, are integral parts of the combat and exploration, so I can't even start putting things together without them. So let's start with the gadgets. Making these gadgets should actually be really fun and interesting. Ew, that's not the kind of stuff I do in this series. Let's do some boring stuff first. One thing I had to do was separate the animation-related code off of the movement state script, which is going to make both scripts easier to deal with. The movement state script is just supposed to spit out the state that represents BrewBot's current condition, while the animation script is going to reference that but remain separate. I also want to get to a couple comment suggestions real quick before we make any gadgets. The first of which is the idea to make BrewBot's handle spin and work as a slow fall ability, which I think is a fantastic idea. Such a fantastic idea that I already made the animation for that, I just don't have the code set up anymore. This slow fall was actually one of the first things that BrewBot was able to do, but I ended up disabling it since it stopped fitting in well with the movement system. But since you guys reminded me, I should try it out with the current movement system, which is quite a bit different. The coding for this ability just has to lower BrewBot's gravity for a moment, but I'd like to figure out a better way of setting the gravity back to normal that won't interfere with other low gravity behavior that I might have in the future. I'm sure there's like a pretty elegant solution to this, but basically I'm changing gravity speed occasionally, and I just want gravity speed to go back afterwards, but not be like harshly being told to go back if that one condition's not true. Whoa. Wait. What if I did this? Is this dumb or is this how you do that? So now, gravity changes, they have to change the 1 every frame. And if they're not changing the 1, then it's just 1. That's totally how you do that, isn't it? Regular jump. 0.5. Back to 1. That's totally how you do that. Now that the slow fall feature is working, I can get rid of all the other cool features that I accidentally added along with it. But once it was functional and I had fine-tuned it to fit this new movement system better, I actually really like it. I think it makes total sense, especially for situations like this, where you're high up and you want to get down safely, and maybe cover some distance too. Another suggestion I want to get to is this one right here, pertaining to my camera issue I had last episode, where I wanted the camera to not clip through walls, but also for BrewBot to be able to move behind objects without the camera jumping to him, and the default spring arm system doesn't really allow for that. Well, apparently, I can just put an area collider around the camera and only switch on the spring arm if there's level geometry detected there. This is one of those solutions that I immediately knew was going to work as soon as I read it. And it sure did, and took 5 minutes to set up. Okay, I'm done listening to you guys, let's make some gadgets. I'm not going to make all of them today, partly because there's a couple of them that I still need to kind of figure out, but what I really want to do is just create a few of them to see if they do make the combat better. Then adding more is just a matter of making additional content for the game, which I can do later on. We'll start with the coffee blade. It's going to be a sword swing attack. You do a wide arcing slash forward, which will cut through a group of enemies and do pretty high damage. It's going to cost 5 coffee beans, which is a pretty medium amount. This attack is best used on a smaller group of higher health enemies, but it's going to work pretty well on larger crowds and single targets too. I want the blade to be a cool liquid thing, like the sketch, and I might be able to get it to look that way by writing a custom shader for it in the future. But for now, it's just going to be a low poly sword that looks vaguely coffee-like. It does almost look like a crystal of instant coffee. Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, the instant coffee sword. That's way cooler than that other idea I had that would have required actual work. The other thing I need is an animation on BrewBot of him swinging the sword. I'm not actually going to put the sword in his hand here. That's something that's going to happen in Godot. So we'll just pose his hand with the sword's placement in mind. And yeah, that's fine. The way I get myself to export these animations is by telling myself that they're placeholders, and I'm going to go back and replace them all anyways. So I got all of that into Godot and went ahead and broke BrewBot so bad bad that I had to revert the project to a previous backup. That did undo a little bit of work, but it fixed whatever it was that even went wrong. Now I can integrate the coffee blade animation into the animation tree and start setting up the actual gadget itself. BrewBot's going to have an overall gadgets node, which is going to manage each individual gadget and keep track of which two are equipped. Then each individual gadget gets its own script that makes it do whatever it's supposed to do when used. I'm going to need to track the coffee sword model onto BrewBot's hand, which luckily they have a node for called Bone Attachment 3D. I made a use gadget function on the coffee blade script, which is going to unhide the sword model, play the swing animation, and then rehide the model. Okay. There clearly needs to be some kind of short cooldown, just enough to keep you from swinging 10 times a second. I spent a little while adding more features like that, narrowing down the conditions under which this gadget can be used, and fixing where it broke other behaviors. Then I made it cost a few coffee beans, and made it push you forward like how punching does. I also added the damage area and used that to read for enemies during the swing and send them a damage signal. Well, this is a fully functional gadget now. It feels pretty good, but I'm gonna need a few more to be able to tell if it's worth having this whole gadget system in the first place. Let's go ahead and add a turret next. This is one of the gadgets that made me want to make gadgets in the first place. I love the idea of spending coffee beans to set out a separate entity that helps you fight, so I threw a model together in Blender, which could use some improvements like the coffee blade model. Then I made some animations. I think I should have used more BrewBot looking textures here. It just doesn't look similar enough to BrewBot to make it feel like it's one of your abilities. But let's just get this into Godot and start making the gadget object. This gadget is quite a bit different than the coffee blade, because it's not just a blade you swing, it's going to act as a spawner for instances of a different object, that object being the turret. But to make things even more complicated, the turret is also a spawner for the coffee bean bullets that it shoots. To make the turret shoot, I ended up using a lot of the code from the bow enemy, which shoots arrows at you, and that worked pretty well. But the beans are just physics objects that push you around. I need to fix that. And I also need to make the turret look at enemies that it spots. I gave the turret a rectangular area that scans forward for enemies. And I'm going to use another bone attachment node, but this time it's going to control the bones transform. That way I can rotate the head of the turret to face whoever's in the scan area, thereby trying to keep them in the scan area as it shoots at them. At first, the beans were shooting straight forward, but like globally forward, not locally forward. But I got that fixed, and made an animation for the bone attachment node, which makes it rotate left, wait for a second, then rotate right, and wait again. And since the scan area is parented beneath the bone attachment node, it's actually scanning left and right for enemies when it does this. But I don't just want the turret to shoot enemies for you. I also want it to take some aggro. So I gave it a health component and made it so that the enemy's aggro can swap if it takes damage from something. So now, if it shoots an enemy who's after you, that enemy's gonna go fight the turret instead. The health bar was all gray and weird, but I got that fixed pretty quickly. I also did have to fix the onion enemy quite a bit, because I hadn't really tested him since updating a bunch of enemy stuff last episode. But even with that fixed, they still don't know how to fight the turret properly. They gotta stand there and intimidate it to death. So I got that sorted out as well, and then went back over to the coffee blade gadget for a second. I wanted to feel more useful, because it's not really as good as the turret right now. So I made it push you quite a bit further, and also made it so that your collision with enemies turns off while you're using it, so you pass right through them. That makes it feel way better for getting through a crowd. You're hitting more enemies and taking less risk of getting hit by them. But before making any more gadgets, I want to touch up the basic combat just a bit more. I don't want my combat system to be a bunch of cool gadgets that you get to use sometimes when you aren't forced to use your crappy, unfun, janky punch ability. I specifically want it to feel safer to punch multiple enemies away from yourself. So I slightly increased the reach of the punch and also the attack speed. And yeah, when I'm standing there punching away a group of enemies, I'm definitely less prone to a random hit catching me out of nowhere. But there's still a special kind of unsatisfying you feel when you're running away from a crowd and then try to swing around and punch them, especially with the slower turn speed that I introduced last episode, which really helped the movement feel like it has weight, but it's also meaning that I have to move back towards the enemy pretty far to even face them and land a hit on them. There's gotta be a way that I can punch towards them while running away from them. Well, that's when I thought of something. I don't want a lock-on system necessarily, but what about some kind of strafe lock? Like a button that you can hold down. We'll go with right click on the mouse or right trigger on controller, which makes BrewBot face the same direction as the camera. Oof, that's not gonna work. I don't know about that. We'll see. Wait. No, oh my gosh, wait. That's working really well. I got it backwards at first, but it turned out to be extremely easy to code. Of course, it would look better with actual directional walking animations, but this feels instantly necessary to the combat. I don't want a lock-on system since not many enemies are going to take that long to fight or require carefully timed blocking or dodging or anything. The combat is going to be pretty open and hectic, but I've been wanting some way to lock your movement to your camera direction, and I think this is the answer. Because the thing is, having a free camera makes 3D platforming and exploration feel really great. But combat games almost always find a way to deal with the camera for you, hence the lock-on system that many games use, which lets you have it both ways. And this strafe lock system does too, but while also leaving you with a bit more camera control and character direction control. Okay, the basic punching combat doesn't feel as sucky anymore. Let's make the coffee slam gadget next. This is going to be the most simple gadget. It's going to cost a lot of coffee beans and do a lot of damage to a lot of stuff all around you all at once. Once I made an animation, I started making the gadget node itself, which is going to be extremely easy to set up. It's just an area that reads for enemies to damage them. I reused all of the damage code from Coffee Blade since the process of opening the damage area and sending the damage signals is the same. Coffee Slam, however, was not quite acting right. It was just not hitting enemies that were close to me for some reason. I looked around a little bit and realized this was happening because enemies were ending up in Brew Bot's basic punch area, which was shadowing them from the slam hitbox. So I made the punch hitbox get hidden anytime you're doing an alternate attack, which fixed most of the issue, but there's still a few enemies not getting hit, which I guess just ended up being because of the crappy damage code that I copied over from Coffee Blade, which wasn't doing a great job maintaining a list of enemies to hit. This is where AI is really useful for showing you a cleaner way of writing something, which is the correct way to use AI, not to generate content because you're too lazy, but to learn about something and put those theories to the test for yourself, to get you to reach certain pieces of information that you can then go off and use on your own. Now that I'm done telling you how to live your life and the slam attack is working, I'm gonna add a new UI feature. When I made the first two gadgets, I was just directly assigning them to gadget slots in the code, but you can't change them that way in the actual game. Now that there are more than two gadgets though, I need a menu for swapping between them. This placeholder menu is gonna have a gadget inventory, and then two gadget sockets above that, but I'm gonna need some icons for these gadgets, so I went into Asprite and made some placeholders. Then I started writing the script for the gadget menu and made it populate the inventory with the gadget icons. Then I connected the signal that gets sent when you select an icon, and that seems to be working since it's printing the name of that slot when it's selected. I realized though that I should make a resource for each gadget icon. That way each icon image is also connected to a name, which can be used to equip the corresponding gadget over on the gadget script. So now if you select a gadget and press one of the gadget buttons while it's selected, it assigns that gadget to that slot. This UI will probably function slightly different in the future, and it's definitely going to look different, but this is the foundation. Alright, let's make one last gadget. We'll do the missile gadget. This is another one that really got me excited to make this whole gadget system. It's going to be kind of like the turret, where the actual gadget node itself is just a point that spawns missile instances. So I made the missile instance and used a temporary mesh. It's going to need two different areas. One of them is going to be a bigger area that looks for enemies to home onto, and the other one is the one that hits enemies and damages them. I spent a little while fine-tuning the spawning and launching of the missile. I want it to shoot straight up, but with an adjustable amount of inaccuracy. I've also got to make them home onto enemies, or not really home, but more like find an enemy and launch in that direction. So it won't keep chasing them, but it will try to hit them with the secondary launch. I made it so that after the missile launches and then starts falling back down, it shuts off its gravity, looks at the closest enemy, and then shoots forward. I also changed it from needing to direct hit enemies to acting more like an explosion by making the damage collider bigger and making it go off when the missile hits an enemy or level geometry. I originally planned on this gadget costing something like 5 or 10 coffee beans and sending out a barrage of missiles, but just sending one at a time for cheaper actually feels really nice. So far, this has got to be the funnest gadget to use. It's also wickedly unbalanced and should be nerfed immediately, which is probably part of that. The gadget system overall is fun. It's actually making the combat kind of enjoyable. I can run away from him and do that. That's so cool. Do a big slam. Boom. Oh my gosh, I can't believe the combat is like cool right now. Like I didn't plan on it being this cool, I guess. I wasn't really thinking of this specifically, but I kind of ended up at it. I got some random bugs fixed after that, like the slam attacks still somehow not hitting enemies. which was because Brew Bot's interact area, which is for interacting with stuff, was tagged as a damage area, so it was doing the same thing that the punch area was doing. I also made the coffee turret placement less glitchy by making a raycast that reads downwards. If there's no floor at all, you can't use the gadget, but if there is a floor, it places the turret at the point that the ray collided with that surface. I also rebound the sprint button on controller to pushing in the left stick, and I made it a toggle so that you don't have to hold it down the whole time. I started thinking about the way enemies drop coffee beans, which is that you just instantly get a fixed number of them when you kill an enemy, so there at least needs to be a visual, but I think it would be better if the enemies actually dropped the beans on the ground and you had to go pick them up, which is literally just the stationary coffee bean pickup, but parented under a rigid body 3D node to give it physics. Then I made it so that each enemy has an adjustable value for the minimum coffee bean drop and the maximum coffee bean drop. Then a random number is picked between those, and a loop which shoots out coffee beans will run that many times. This is the only time so far that I've used a while loop in this whole game, because they're probably the easiest way to crash your software, since if you let them, they'll try to run as many times as they possibly can within a single frame, therefore maxing out however much processing power that the software is allowed. So you've got to make sure that the while loop is working towards shutting itself off each time it runs. I also added a little bit of random direction in there and a very short delay, which gives it a cool offset fountain effect. Well, this looks pretty good, and it actually changes the combat quite a bit, and in a way that I think it needed, because now, instead of ranged gadget attacks essentially refunding themselves on kills, you have to actually go over there and pick the beans up, which kind of keeps you moving around. It places points of interest in areas that could be dangerous, creating little moments of risk-reward evaluation. Alright, we've added gadgets, we've improved a few aspects of the combat, but I think there's still one major issue to deal with, and that's the enemy AI. They're dumb as crap right now, because they just chase you directly, there's no actual pathfinding, which is a pretty complicated thing that I don't really want to set up. But luckily, Godot has built-in classes that do all of this on their own, one of them being the navigation region, which evaluates your level geometry and establishes walkable surface that enemies can pathfind across. Then you need each enemy to have a navigation agent node, which is the thing that does the pathfinding and drives the movement, which means I need to uproot most of my enemy movement code. I'll start with the onion enemy since his movement is the most simple. There were all kinds of weird issues and caveats to attend to in order for any of it to work, but it didn't take that long for the onion enemy to be moving again, and basically working, and actually pathfinding somewhat intelligently. I figured I'd convert the golem enemy next, and then it would be easier to just use this same onion enemy script on him. And actually, I didn't even need to alter the script itself, just the values on the navigation agent. It ended up being the case that none of the enemies I have so far needed their own movement scripts anymore. It's not perfect. The tall enemies, for example, get stuck on this bridge, which is something I was not really able to figure out, but it's better and it's easier to work with, which is as much as you can hope for when updating something. I decided to try and bring back that old feature where the moss ball could damage other enemies with a stomp attack. And I did get it working, but it made the combat feel too messy and kinda muddied the waters for damage feedback. So instead, I just made the stomp attack deal knockback to enemies. And that's what I was looking for. It adds an interesting enemy interaction, which could have actual effects on the combat, like throwing an onion enemy into you, and it also helps sell the power of the attack. After that, it was back to random little bits of combat-related progress, like making an actual model for the missile, and playing around with some missile particle effects. They didn't look good, so I ended up just hiding them, but they're actually programmed and everything, so when I do have actual visuals ready, I can set that up really easily. Over on the enemy AI, there's something I really need to fix, which is the fact that enemies can't do anything about you just jumping up on top of something. So I need to add a jumping function. It's not going to use the navigation agent. Matter of fact, it's actually going to shut down the navigation agent while that's happening. For the enemy to know when it needs to jump, it's going to look for situations where it's trying to chase something, but it's moving very, very slowly, meaning the enemy is stuck. And if that happens for long enough without ever going above a certain speed, the enemy fires a jump function, which gets the difference in elevation between itself and the target that it's trying to chase. Then it launches itself upward by a small amount, multiplied by that height difference. And to get onto the ledge, it launches itself forward. But the time between the upward launch and the forward launch is also multiplied by the height difference, so it waits longer to go forward if the ledge is higher, which works perfectly. Well, I'd say this is about all I can do for this month. But let's get to a couple more comment suggestions before we end this off. The first of which is the fact that the bow on top of the bow enemy is actually a slingshot since the limbs are not flexing, so it's getting all the power from the vine. This is the definition of not a big deal, and I really don't need to do anything about it. But now that my attention has been brought to it, I can't just let it be there the whole time doing that. So I'll make a bone that controls the bow limbs and make them kinda bend back when it draws and fires. Okay, sure, whatever, I'm just gonna pretend that looks really good. The other suggestion I wanted to get to was this one about adding hit stop to the jab punch. I didn't really know what that was at first, but it just means that when you actually hit an enemy with the jab punch, it would freeze the animation very briefly. So I set that up by adding a timescale node to the end of the animation tree, which drives BrewBot's animations, and set that speed to 0 for a little under 1/10 of a second when you land a hit, which undoubtedly does make this feel better. And it also increases your visual feedback gap between missing and hitting, which is always a good thing. Well, that's all for this time. I'm kinda surprised how much got done. I think the project really is getting to that point where there's just more to show. More actual changes are happening with each hour of work. We've got 4 fully functional gadgets added, and they did end up being fun to use. I was hoping that they would improve the combat to the extent that I could no longer imagine the combat without them, and I think that's where we're at now. It's probably going to be a while before we need to work on combat again. Maybe when more gadgets and enemies start getting added, and also when I have to make the first boss fight. But there is a lot to do before that. Next episode, we're going to get the decoration system made, building a basic cafe area, creating the data structures, and making the system that lets you place decorations. And after that episode, I think we're going to start prototyping the open level system and get everything tied together. Anyways, I'll be working on that decoration system until around this time next month. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.